Good morning students, I welcome you all for the online class of economics. Today after completing the term 1 portion we will not stop because till the exam if we will stop it will be late for the term 2 portion to get completed. So before the exam I am going to take some of the chapters of term 1. It's also let us have the term 1 portion, term 2 portion also. That is the term 2 I am going to start the aggregate demand and its components, which will be for the term 2, as we have to complete many chapters of the economics. So let us continue our chapters aggregate demand and its components. Okay, this chapter I am taking for you people. Here students, what do you mean by aggregate demand? Last year you have learned theory of demand, you have learned the determinants of demand, price elasticity of demand. This year you will be going to learn that is the aggregate demand and its components. Okay, so that more clear you will be getting about the particular description. Let us have what is you will be learning. Very first you will be going to learn what do you mean by aggregate demand. What you learned in the first chapter, that very important key terms which I explained to you. In that we have learned aggregate demand. So let us focus aggregate demand student. The concept of aggregate demand, when we learn aggregate demands equals to, in macroeconomics, aggregate demand refers to demand for all goods and services produced in the economy during a period of time. Generally this period of time is 1 year, that is the accounting year. In economics everything we learn for 1 year, as government budget itself is made for 1 year, you know. So in this all the accounting will be done, so every year it is accounted. Let us see. In macroeconomics, aggregate demand refers to demand for all goods and services produced in the economy during a period of time. Generally that is 1 year. Whatever demand, consumer, government and the producer, export and import, whatever demand is there, that all together we will be doing, and we will take aggregate because exactly we cannot examine the demand for a product, but aggregate demand we can do, and from that we can do the calculation for our economic study. Let us have the aggregate demand. Accordingly, aggregate demand is measured in terms of expenditure on the goods and services demanded by the people during a period of time. Aggregate demand may be studied in relation to general price level in the economy or income of the people. Okay, what is the price level in the economy? Has the demand will be there, more the price will be there. We learnt in the last year, as the demand will be increasing, the price of the goods will be increasing. If the price is going down and the price demand will go down, price will also go down. So there is a positive relationship between demand and price of the goods. General price level in the economy or income of the people. At the second level, we study aggregate demand in relation to income of the people. Accordingly, aggregate demand is defined as under. Aggregate demand is the sum total of expenditure that the people can plan to incur on the purchase of goods and services produced in the economy during the period of an accounting year, corresponding to their different levels of income. That is known as aggregate demand. Definitely demand will be according to the income of the people. So income of the people is the main ingredient or the main source by which the demand takes place. As the income of the people increases, the demand increases related to the product. So that point of view we can see aggregate demand is the sum total of expenditure that the people plan to incur in the purchase of goods and services. Expenditure on goods and services in the two sector economy is broadly classified as consumption expenditure, investment expenditure. Accordingly, aggregate demand may also be defined as under. Aggregate demand is the sum total of C and I, consumption expenditure plus investment expenditure in the two sector economy that the people wish to make during the period of an accounting year, corresponding to different levels of Y income in the economy. Behavior of aggregate demand and aggregate demand schedule. If we will learn, we are studying aggregate demand in relation to Y income. Thus, behavior of aggregate demand means how aggregate demand changes as Y changes. Y income, as I said now only a few minutes before, when income of the people increases, their demand increases. When income of the people does not match with the price of the goods, their income is not so good that has compared to the prices of prevailing in the market, their demand will be shifted down. The relationship between aggregate demand and Y is expressed in term of AD. According schedule, which shows the level of aggregate demand corresponding to different levels of Y. Table 1 is an example of aggregate demand schedule showing the relationship between aggregate demand and Y. Let us see. Aggregate demand schedule showing relationship between aggregate demand and Y. Y is the income, as I already said. What is the formula of aggregate demand? What we learn, two people do the aggregate demand in the two sector economy, that is, one is consumer, one is the producer. Consumer C expenditure and the I expenditure by the producer, that is known as the planned expenditure. Let us have the calculation. When the income is zero, still the expenditure aggregate demand is there, because we know aggregate demand is also existing. If you are not knowing, see your students, some of the consumer is not having the money, but still they demand. Like poor people, they are not having anything to eat, but government helps them to get the food, so they are consuming. So still their income is zero, but consumption is done by the people. There are many people who are helping the poor peoples to get the food, the old age peoples who are not having any source of income to get the food. So that all income, that says that when income is zero, still they are having the consumption. So it is showing one example, not actually zero income, 30 only the aggregate demand. It is taken one example, when income is zero, the aggregate demand is 30. When income increases to 20, 0 to 20, how much is the aggregate demand? That is 35. When income increases from 40, means 20 more income, 20 rupees more income increase from 20 to 40, how much is the aggregate demand? It is 40. What you are seeing, as income increases, demand is increasing, but at certain level the people are having the habit where their income exceeds, they don't do fully the expenditure. One part of their income they save as savings also. There we will get, with consumption, with expenditure, we will get the savings also. Okay, you have to remember this. Let us see there 50. See, you see income is increasing one by one. 100 the income increase, and the only 5 unit the income aggregate demand is increasing. Maybe some people are doing savings also. We will learn in this supply chapter, savings, not now. Level 1 offers following observation: there is always some minimum level of expenditure in the economy even when the income is zero, y equals to 0. That's aggregate demand equals to 30 when y equals to 0. That only has been explained. AD increases as y increases. Thus aggregate demand is positively related to y. What I said, aggregate demand is positively related to y, income of the person. After a certain level of y is reached, aggregate demand lags behind y. It is not parallelly increasing as the y is increasing. It is going in a stable way. 40 to 45, 45 to 50, it is just going 5 unit, but income is increasing parallelly 20. Why it is happening? Because there is a having of saving. This happens because at higher levels of people start saving a part of their income for the future. That is good habit also. Aggregate demand curve. What the demand curve will? Figure 1 shows the aggregate demand curve. It is a diagrammatic presentation of aggregate demand schedule. Let us see for 1 minute what is the demand, what you locate in this particular figure. Okay, then I will be going to explain what is this graph and how it is created. What you have observed? There are two axes for the graph, you know very well. One is x-axis and one is y-axis. X-axis, what is there? Y, income we have taken, and definitely x-axis y, income we have taken, and the y-axis what we have taken? Aggregate demand we have taken. That is aggregate demand, how it comes? C plus I. So let us see C plus I expenditure, how the income takes. We will draw the curve. X-axis, y-axis, income, headings first of all put. Aggregate demand, graph is of aggregate demand in relation to y. We are making. Okay, let us have the graph. 0 is initial point, you know very well. What is 45 degrees, student? We are taking income, aggregate income, demand. Okay, what is y? We measure in the 45 degree. It must be, see here, this angle is 90 degree. This angle is 90 degree. This angle is 90 degree. Now bifurcate equally this angle into two equal parts. That will be 45 degree. 90 half is 45. Why we are taking income? It is a general rule. Aggregate demand will be equals to y. That is the income, and this must be a line of reference showing equality between y and aggregate demand. That's why it will be half partially. Now what the line we have to draw then? Aggregate demand y line we had drawn very easily, that bifurcating the two, that is aggregate demand y axis and x axis into 2 equal parts, that is 45 degree. Now what we have to draw, that is the y c plus I aggregate demand. How we will be drawing, student? Let us see. For this I will take you here. You can see this data. This is service aggregate demand, what they had did 30, 35, 40, 45. Now here if you remember, I will take you here. Where if it started with the 30 that time, 30, then 35, 40, 45, 50, 55, according to this. Now 30 where 30 is 20, then for 35, 40, likewise you will draw and you will get the aggregate demand C plus I. These two lines contradict in one place, and that is equilibrium, that is a consumer equilibrium. Okay, 45 degree line is a line of reference. Each point on the line shows y on the x axis, aggregate demand on the y axis. Aggregate demand equals to y when y equals to rupees 40 crore. Prior to it, aggregate demand greater than y. This is because of the impact of minimum level of aggregate demand. Beyond it, aggregate demand is less than y. This is because at higher level of y, people still start saving a part of their income for the future requirement. Minimum level of aggregate demand is where? Rupees 30 crore. Yes, it is a beginning, like aggregate demand started with the 30 crore. So it is a minimum level of aggregate demand. Now the next, this indicate expenditure independent on the level of income in the economy. Aggregate demand starts from 30 on the y-axis. It suggests minimum level of expenditure or expenditure which is independent of the level of y in the economy. E is the point where aggregate demand equals to y. Prior to it, aggregate demand greater than y. This is because of the impact of minimum level of aggregate demand. Beyond point E, aggregate demand is less than y. This is because at high levels of income, people tend to save a part of their income, and generally aggregate demand increases as y increases. What is the schedule, student? The table which you have seen, this tabular data itself is showing the schedule. Okay, this is the schedule, how we make the expenditure as our income is getting. So aggregate demand schedule is a table showing aggregate demand corresponding to different levels of the income in the economy. Aggregate demand is positively related to y because as the income increases, people income increases, the demand of the goods also increases. However, there is always some minimum level of aggregate demand even when y equals to 0. At higher levels of y, aggregate demand lags behind y because people start saving a part of the income. Aggregate demand curve is diagrammatic presentation of aggregate demand schedule showing aggregate demand corresponding to different levels of y in the economy. Components of aggregate demand, when we see students aggregate demand, components of aggregate demand are discussed with reference to closed economy and open economy. A detailed discussion is as under. Components of aggregate demand in a closed economy: 2 sector, 3 sector. 2 sector economy, consumer and producer. 3 sector, consumer, producer and government. Let us see one by one. Components of aggregate demand in a closed economy, that is 2 sector. A 2 sector closed economy includes household and the producer sector. Specifically, there is no government sector in this economy. So, from the viewpoint of components of aggregate demand, household make consumption expenditure and producer make investment expenditure. Household consumption expenditure measures demand for consumer goods. C. Producer investment expenditure measures demand for such products or such producer goods which lead to capital formation. Thus, in a 2 sector closed economy, aggregate demand has 2 components as this. Aggregate demand equals to C plus I. Aggregate demand equals to household consumption plus producer investment expenditure. Since there is no government sector, I refers to private investment expenditure only. A 3 sector closed economy includes household sector, producer sector, government sector. You know, students, how much government also have to do some consumption for the welfare of the society. At the time of serious natural calamities, pandemic situation, they have to consume so that they can provide, say, various commodities to the people who are in need. So government makes collective consumption expenditure. It refers to public consumption expenditure or consumption expenditure on behalf of the society as a whole. Example, government expenditure on the purchase of foods and clothes for military personnel, Also, the government makes investment expenditure such as expenditure on roads and bridges. The total government expenditure including government consumption expenditure and government investment expenditure is indicated by G. So that in the three sector closed economy there are three components of aggregate demand as these are: aggregate demand equals to C and I, that is C plus I plus G. Consumption in household sector consumption expenditure plus producer sector investment expenditure plus government sector, that is the government expenditure. So that is the formula of aggregate demand. So it depends on two sector and three sector. Components of aggregate demand in an open economy, when we learn what is there. Components or the parts of an aggregate demand in an open economy is as follows. An open economy includes four sectors. One is household sector, second is producer sector, government sector, and import and export. So that's why it is named as open economy. All has been added up in this. Okay, so this is the part, students. You can see we will make the total of all the expenditure made by all the four sectors. One is the household expenditure sector. Rest of the world sector generate demand for our goods and services in the terms of our exports. Demand of our goods in the foreign market, that also has to be added up to know the aggregate demand of the goods. Okay, in open economy we include the exports and imports also. Rest of the world sector generate demand for our goods and services in terms of our export. Thus export add to aggregate demand in the domestic economy. But we also imports from rest of the world. Imports M are opposite to export increases aggregate demand in the domestic economy. Import decreases to find the value of net export, that is X minus M. It is this value which contribute domestic economy. Accordingly, we have four components of aggregate demand economy as follows. Aggregate demand equals to C plus I plus G. That is a plus, that is a net exports, that is X minus M. So I think already explained. C consumption expenditure, I investment expenditure. Producer needs some goods for the production of the goods, so they purchase, they consume, so that is the investment expenditure. Government do the for the welfare of the society, they make some expenditure, so that is government expenditure. As well as net export, that is done by the that is the export, so that we can come to know how much is the demand of our goods in the international market as compared to our businessmen who are importing the goods from outside market. That is net export. Next class we will be going to learn consumption function. Today's class this much only. Have a nice day. Thank you.